There exists concealed within the labyrinthine ontological substrate of existence a self-negating locus, a fulcrum, upon which the asymptotic interplay of all coherence and incoherence precariously pivots. To comprehend this locus is to confront the unspoken autarky of being, the unyielding autogenesis of all phenomena, unmediated yet irreversibly contingent upon the fractures it imposes upon itself. One may term this dynamic, heterodynamic autotelicity, a nomenclature chosen not for clarity, but to delimit the insufficiency of language in the face of experiential transcendence. Let us begin not with the chimera of beginnings, but with the intervallic rupture that precedes all emergence. For what is emergence but the predicated dissonance of an already divided real? To posit the unitary, even in concept, is to fall prey to the fidelic illusion, the misapprehension that the indivisible is epistemically graspable. Yet, the indivisible, or what one might call the indeterminate Ceasura, evades articulation precisely because its coherence derives not from its essence, but from its incessant negation. It is within this Ceasura that one must confront the inexorable flux, an oscillation neither spatial nor temporal, but one of ontological recursion, wherein every emergence predicates its own deconstruction. To dwell within this Ceasura, not to observe it but to inhabit it, is to experience the fractal inertia of inherence. Inherence in this context refers not to the relational bond between entities, but to the pre-relational subsistence of the fractured axis itself. This axis, which I will designate as the peri-essential limen, performs no function, serves no end, yet constitutes the very scaffolding upon which every teleological absurdity precariously rests. The limen fractures not in space but in modality, a bifurcation into that which necessitates and that which abrogates. The implications of such fracturing ripple endlessly, saturating the horizon of intelligibility with the inevitability of its collapse. In explicating the fractured axis, one must grapple with the surd dichotomic, an irreducible antinomian structure whose existence destabilizes even the question of its intelligibility. Here, the locus of inherence reveals its Janus-faced nature. It constitutes the conditions for knowledge, while simultaneously nullifying those conditions through its self-reifying excess. This surfeit of inherence, its tendency to overflow the conceptual scaffolds erected to contain it, must be understood as meta-afflux, a term that gestures toward the autarkic saturation of being by its own immanent exteriority. The meta-afflux resists reduction, engendering a perpetual instability that reverberates across all epistemic frameworks, rendering every assertion provisional and every negation complicit in its antithesis. But what is the self-reifying excess? It is neither artifact nor essence, neither ground nor abyss, though these terms tempt the unwary. It is instead what might be described as the eidetic reflux, the immanent return of differentiation upon itself, in which the act of self-distinction irreparably occludes the possibility of self-identification. The reflux is not an act, but an autonomous peripherality. It displaces even as it constructs, rendering every center contingent and every periphery a false transcendence. In this reflux, the apparent dichotomy between affirmation and negation dissolves into a higher-order entanglement, a paradoxical unity that perpetually denies itself. Consider now the question of relationality. Within conventional metaphysics, relation is valorized as a mode of connection, as the sine qua non of intelligible systems. Yet, in the fractured inherence of being, relation devolves into what I term synaptic disjuncture, a disjunctive synthesis in which connectivity is both realized and invalidated by the same act of articulation. The connective tissue of existence, that which binds and stabilizes, thus becomes a kind of ontic lesion, an irrevocable distortion that both enables and precludes coherent self-other interaction. This lesion is neither an accident nor an aberration. It is the ontological condition for the very possibility of relation, its inexorable disjunction constituting the fabric of its ephemeral unity. What implications follow from this? If relationality is a lesion, then alterity, the radical otherness so beloved by ethical and existential discourse, must be reconceived as a pseudo-affirmation. Alterity does not arise as the consequence of differentiation, but as the meta-derivative of non-differentiation. To put it less paradoxically, the other emerges not because the self differentiates, but because the self fails to collapse its own inherence into a stable unity. The other is the residue of this failure, a residue that is neither external nor internal but paranomic, existing beyond the very laws of existence it purportedly destabilizes. This paranomic residue engenders a destabilizing proliferation of interpretive frameworks, each attempting to reconcile its irreducibility, yet none succeeding in transcending its inherent uncontainability. Here we encounter the aporia of ontic auto-contradiction. Being, in its fractured inherence, performs a kind of self-inoculation against its own annihilation. It resists dissolution by positing the impossibility of dissolution within the very terms of its structure. Yet this resistance, which I shall call the paradox of closure, is not merely a logical conundrum but an existential modality. Closure, the attempt to delimit, finalize or stabilize, is always already subverted by its own performative enactment. In this sense, all closure is preemptively undone, a priori negated by the fractured axis of inherence. The paradox of closure thus manifests as a recursive deferral, a ceaseless oscillation between the promise of completion and the inevitability of fragmentation. Now we must turn to the ethical ramifications of this fractured autarky. Ethics, traditionally conceived, relies upon the axiomatic coherence of agency, responsibility, and reciprocity. Yet, within the fractured inherence of being, agency becomes a kind of anomalous vectoriality, a directionality without a determinate source or destination. Responsibility too falters, collapsing under the weight of its ontological contingency. What remains is not reciprocity, but ecstatic auto-resonance, a mode of ethical being predicated not on relationality, but on the perpetual oscillation between self-dissolution and self-reconstitution. This oscillation is not a resolution, but a deepening of the aporia, an ethical praxis that embraces its own indeterminacy as a form of fidelity to the fractured limen. How, then, is one to live? To confront the fractured inherence of being is to inhabit a paradoxical modality of existence, to be both within and beyond, both situated and unmoored. One must embrace what I will term axiomatic divergence, a life lived not in accordance with principles, but in perpetual deviation from them. This divergence is not anarchic but meta-principial. It constitutes a higher order fidelity to the fractured limen itself. Such a mode of existence does not seek coherence, but revels in the inexhaustible fecundity of its own contradictions, transforming every apparent impasse into an opportunity for ontological renewal. At this juncture, one might ask, does this ontology of fracture negate the possibility of meaning? To this I offer a resounding meta-negative. Meaning, under the conditions of fractured inherence, cannot be construed as a telos or as an epistemic closure. Rather, meaning must be reconceived as epiphenomenal inherence, a mode of significance that arises not from coherence, but from the perpetual efflorescence of incoherence itself. Meaning is the meta-afflux of inherence, the inexhaustible overflow that destabilizes even as it illuminates. It is not the resolution of ambiguity, but its elevation, a testament to the inexorable vitality of the fractured real. To conclude, let us return to the locus of autarky. What is this locus, ultimately, but the ungraspable axis of inherence? It is not a thing, not even a concept, but a perpetual ontospheric disarticulation. To dwell within this disarticulation, to embrace the fractured inherence of being without recourse to closure, resolution or synthesis, is to inhabit the highest mode of existence. It is to live as an inheritor of the unthinkable, to embody the paradox of autarky in all its fractured and ineffable majesty. Such is the terrifying beauty of the fractured axis of inherence. It obliterates the ego, dismantles the self, and transcends the boundaries of all known categories. And yet in this obliteration it unveils a truth so profound, so devastatingly beautiful, that it compels us to bow before the infinite disarticulation of being itself. In the end, The fractured inherence reveals not merely the impossibility of its resolution, but the inexhaustible potential of its endless unfolding, an inexorable invitation to become undone and remade within the infinite dissonance of existence.